Hey everyone, and welcome back to Online Latin. Today we are coming to very close to the end of the Wheelock book, and we're going to be talking about some different case usages, the ablative case, the accusative case, the dative case. We'll also be talking about supines, which is another form of the perfect passive participle, and then we'll finish off by talking about a relative clause, a subjunctive relative clause. So we'll go ahead and jump in then. We'll begin by talking about place constructions. Now, there are three different place constructions that we're going to talk about today: place where, place from which, and place to which. Now, the first one is a construction that doesn't have any motion, so we'll begin there. And we can do this in two ways. We can do all of these with a preposition or without a preposition. And you'll see how the different cases are really at play when we're doing these without prepositions. Remember, unlike in English, Latin doesn't always need prepositions. So when we're dealing with place where, the prepositions that we would use are in or sub. And we're going to use these with the ablative case. And an example of this would be like in urbe, which means in the city. If I wanted to do this without a preposition, this happens in certain circumstances. So we use a preposition most of the time, but in certain circumstances, for instance, when we're dealing with names of cities, names of towns, small islands, and certain nouns, domus, humus, or rus, then we don't need a preposition. Now, specifically when we're talking about the place where, the location, for instance here, in the city, like in urbe, when we're doing this with a proper place, we call this the locative. And this is a case unto itself, although for first and second declension singular nouns, this is going to look a lot like the genitive case. For other nouns, we use the ablative. And an example of this would be like, where are you? Well, you're in Rome. And so instead of saying in Roma, you would just say Rome or Romai, depending on how you want to pronounce that. Notice that's a genitive singular ending. Let's move on to the place from which. The place from which utilizes the prepositions ab, de, or ex, and also uses the ablative case. So, to use our same example, instead of in urbe, this is a place from which, like out of, ex urbe. Notice also is using the ablative case, but instead of in the city, in urbe, it's out of the city. There's movement, ex urbe. So it's from the city, out from the city. When we're dealing with, these proper names or domus, humus, rus, and are not using a preposition then, we're just going to allow the ablative case to stand on its own. And I'll put a small line here to distinguish between. Don't want to mix those up. So this would be the ablative case. Just on its own, can mean going away from, which makes sense because that's what the ablative does. It shows separation. And an example then, specifically, to use the same example from before, with Rome in the ablative case would be Roma, from Rome, out from Rome, away from Rome. Now going in the opposite direction, as Latin shows separation with the ablative, and even shows static motion with the ablative, or non-motion with the ablative. When you're going towards something, that's when we use the accusative case. So place to which uses the prepositions in, ad, and sub, plus the accusative. And so this would look something like, instead of in urbe, in the city, or ex urbe, away from the city, out of the city, this would be in, again, urbim. So note the difference here. In urbim is not just in the city, it's into the city, going toward. And again, it follows then on the side, on the right side there, that right column that has our proper names. Also just use the accusative case. And for the same example, if I want to talk about going into Rome or toward Rome, I'm going to use Romam. So these are place constructions. Today we're also talking about another use of the accusative case, and that is the accusative of duration of time. And we've talked about temporal uses of the ablative case, but the accusative case can be used to show duration of time with no preposition, as in something is occurring for a certain duration. An example of this would be multos annos. Now, this is just an accusative plural construction, but it can mean for many years. It's often used with the word natus, and it might look like this: vigenti annos natus. And that would be something like at the age of 20. And it really means something like the duration of time since birth when it's used with natus. So it's 20 years since birth, which means at the age of 20. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to a dative usage. We recently talked about different uses of the dative, and today we want to talk about the dative of reference. This is when the dative case is used to indicate a person or thing to which something refers. It also shows perspective or special interest. So an example of this would be rex bonus multis est, and this is going to show reference. The king is good multis, too many, with reference toward many, or with special interest to many. So the king is good to many. Now, you might just translate this. You might guess that's the translation just because it's the dative case. And when you get a sense of what these cases are really about, this might come very natural to you without even knowing what the dative of reference is. So you might have guessed that. But again, that's what this is called, the dative of reference. So the example, the king is good to many. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to supines. The important thing to know about supines is that they're formed with the perfect passive participle, also known as the fourth principal part, except they're only going to appear in the accusative or ablative singular, and not just as the accusative or ablative singular, but on top of that, as a fourth declension noun. Now, it might be tempting to regard this as a first or second declension adjective, but they are declined as a fourth declension noun. And not only do they take the accusative and the ablative singular, but they're used in different ways when you're dealing with the different cases here, because again, the accusative and the ablative mean very different things. Ablative typically is, again, separation or static, and accusative is motion toward, as we're just talking about. So let's take an accusative example. As you can see from the example, the accusative supine is used with verbs of motion to indicate purpose. And again, this kind of goes along with the motion toward thing, purpose. This is for something. And so we have the example here, ibant Romam persuasum amicis. They were going to Rome. There's that motion toward with the proper name Rome. They were going to Rome to persuade their friends. And you can see that is our supine and the accusative, that fourth declension accusative, and frankly looks like a second declension accusative singular anyway. So this is for the purpose of persuading their friends. The ablative case then has a slightly different meaning. The example here, facile, factu, and factu is our ablative supine. And what it means here, you could translate this very woodenly as easy, facile, easy, with respect to doing. Again, that's our supine. Easy with respect to doing. This is like an ablative of respect. Or you could just translate it as easy to do. Easy to do. That's because the ablative is used with the neuter of certain adjectives to indicate in what respect something is applicable. So again, your supine, fourth principal part, accusative and ablative singular as a fourth declension noun. The accusative, verbs of motion to indicate purpose. The ablative, used with the neuter of certain adjectives to indicate in what respect something is applicable or is happening. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about today is a certain kind of a relative clause. It's called the relative clause of characteristic. And this really is a relative clause with a subjunctive verb. So it begins with the relative pronoun, and then we have our subjunctive verb. And what this does is it describes the general quality of the antecedent of the relative pronoun. So here's an example. Hic est liber. This is a book, or this is the book. Now we'll go ahead and add a relative clause of characteristic to describe the book. Quem omnes legant. So again, hic est liber, quem omnes legant as our relative clause. And again, it's describing the book. And we could translate this somewhat woodenly as, this is a book that all would read. Or, if we want to really dig into this relative clause of characteristic and bring out the real meaning here, we might translate it as, this is the kind of book that all would read. Again, this relative clause is describing a characteristic of the antecedent. This is the kind of book that all would read. And therefore, that's why we are using the subjunctive mood. Okay, that's all that I've got for you today. We are going to be finishing up the Wheelock book very soon. Remember to do your readings if you haven't done this already, do your exercises, and we'll see you next week.